up, everybody? Okay, egoproctor here. This is an exploration of time and money. We're getting into time and money because there's something on my screen I'm trying to scratch off. All right, because William Goatsman is trying to make finance and time essentially the most important things of human civilization, and they're not. They're just garbage ideas. I mean, they're useful, but they're not something we need to be building our entire concept of reality out of. When I say garbage ideas, they're garbage ideas. Okay, so here he talks about time. Let's see if I can get this screen reader to work.
Introduction. Finance is often regarded as an abstract, mathematical subject that occasionally calls attention to itself by dramatic crises or as a symbol of excess. In fact, finance has been an integral part of the development of human society over the past 5,000 years. Finance played a key role in the development of the first cities, the emergence of classical empires, and the exploration of the world. The history of finance is an exciting story. For example, writing was invented in the ancient Near East specifically for recording financial contracts. Finance was integral to the first complex models of time and risk, the golden age of Athens owes as.
Okay. But let's take a look at what time is. What is time?
Brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Modern cosmology fuses the concepts of space and time into a thing called a four-dimensional continuum. Albert Einstein predicted, and recently scientists have claimed to observe, ripples in the so-called fabric of space-time. But is it valid to define time in such a way as to reify it? And does a more valid definition of time exist? Today we explore one of the most basic questions in all of cosmology. What is time?
First of all, let's make sure that we understand that there's a difference between the words time and eternity, because they're not the same. The definition of eternity may be somewhat difficult to talk about, but the definition of time can be very simple and clear. Since time is included in and affects not only our everyday lives, but also many physics equations and chemical formulations, a proper definition of time is of the utmost importance. It is helpful to realize that the chemical reactions in the vessel are not really affected by some mysterious thing called time, but by the number of contacts or collisions that take place in the soup of atoms or molecules. That is what the factor T, or time, really stands for. So, we have three premises. Number one, eternity may be a somewhat mystical overarching reality outside of the physical universe, but time is not. Nor is time a thing that anybody can do anything to. In other words, it cannot be reified. Premise number two, the universe.
Okay. So, eternity here, what he's talking about is eternity is a concept. Sure, you can't manifest it. You can't do anything with it because you're not going to live for eternity to see it. Except for right the fuck now is eternal. I mean, your consciousness is right now. There's no place else for your consciousness to be but right the fuck now. Your consciousness can't be tomorrow and it can't be yesterday. It's right now. Now, you can think about yesterday and you can think about tomorrow right now, but you're here right now. And that's it. This experience of right now, when does it begin? And when's it going to end? Because anything that's ever experienced the universe has been part of this now. And we don't know how old this thing is. There's no evidence of a beginning of this universe. So right now is the eternity. Quit thinking about a past and quit thinking about a future, and then you get into the right now, and it never fucking ends. I don't know anything about death. I haven't walked through it yet. When it comes, it's just another part of this cycle. And if our medicine improves to the point where the body doesn't have to die, then we don't have to worry about it. But for right now,
doesn't exist in time, but time exists in the universe. Premise number 3. The proper definition of time is exactly this: the sequence of events in the material universe. The notable philosopher Immanuel Kant, considered by some to be the center of modern philosophy, insists that he has given a rigorous and conclusive proof for the proposition that the universe had a beginning in time, and other philosophers has characterized the proof as certain. He also insists that he has given a rigorous and conclusive proof for the proposition that the universe did not have a beginning in time, and other philosophers have characterized the proof as certain. Of course, this is a straightforward violation of the law of contradiction, a concept held to be inviolate. Kant seems to suggest not that both of these proofs are true, but that they are both false. Well, this assertion of Kant's is a violation of another time-honored concept, the law of the excluded middle, which has it that two contradictory propositions cannot both be false, nor can these two be true.
Okay, so this ended up getting attacked in something they call constructionist logic. So this is classical logic, but then constructional logic got into the idea of, well, you can't just assert that these two things are impossible. You've got to be able to show me that you can demonstrate that there's no way for these things to connect. And then it opened up new ways of playing with mathematics and ideas. And essentially what we get into, you can get into Alan Watts, you can get into linguistics, is all of this is just linguistic play and identification. Is you're taking abstractions of the universe and then you're playing with them inside your imagination. And sometimes we can get these rules to match up with what we see, but for the most part, they don't. When you get into Victor Schauberger, you'll see that he was able to show that the law of conservation of energy doesn't exist. And Newton's gravity is just broken. We've known that for a long time. We just don't want to accept it.
If two contradictory propositions can both be considered false, then they can both be considered true. And yet, Kant accepts the conclusion that they are both false and rejects the conclusion that they are both true. Houston, we have a problem here. What is going on? What is this problem? The following treatise on what time really is gives us the explanation, but I will relate first what the eminent philosopher G.E. Moore has to say about Kant's assertions. Quote, now suppose we say that, instead of proving these two propositions, what his proofs really prove is the following two hypothetical propositions. Namely, number one, if the world exists in time at all, then it must have had a beginning. And or two, if the world exists in time at all, then it can have had no beginning. For if we say that what Kant proved is merely these two hypotheticals, then he has not proved that these two contradictory propositions are both of them true. For these two hypotheticals do not contradict each other. Of course, clearly the if statements in both above are false. So, the bottom line is the universe does not exist in time, but time exists in the universe. Back in the summer of 2000, the chief astronomer and director of the U.S. Naval Observatory, the late Tom Van Flandern, and I were over in Italy to give presentations at the annual University of Milano Bergamo Symposium. Both of us were staying up in Bergamo, about an hour's train ride down to Milano. One morning we sat together on the train and talked about time. He is the thinker that really kick-started me to deal philosophically with this subject. He said that he thinks about it along these lines. He asked me to imagine there was nothing except empty space with just a faucet in it. The faucet drips. The faucet drips again. He asked me how much time there was between the drips. And I saw and we agreed that the question was unanswerable. There was nothing that we could say. Then he asked me to visualize a second dripping faucet, one that drips 60 times for every time the first faucet drips. Now what can we say? Well, we can remark about the ratio being 60 to 1 on a regular basis. And then we add a third faucet that drips 60 times for every time the second faucet drips. Now we can remark not only about the mathematical ratios, but we can talk now about cycles within cycles and regularity in their relationships. Of course, you recognize the comparability to seconds and minutes and hours here. The experience of reality, the experience of life content, and the experience of meaning is based on events. The above seems to be so obvious that it is questionable to mention it. However, there are three types of events. The first are those that we relate to as quantitative, where they are triggered or created by the physical, mechanical cycles that have been set in motion and that have no further impact or meaning in and of themselves. And the second type are those that we relate to as qualitative, where they are not cyclical but have some good or bad impact on the quality of life.
Good or bad doesn't
and
have
three,
any meaning. Not really.
those that are qualitative but also purposeful, in that these events are triggered by some level of volition.
Okay, so now within the concept of culture and then the human experience, these last two are functional, right? They work. Except for the issue is that good or bad are linguistic concepts based on a specific perception of reality. I mean, right? We're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction event on this planet. So whether we survive or not has nothing to do with good or bad for the planet. For us, maybe, right? Because we have this addiction to surviving. But we all know that everybody around us dies. And unless we fix our medicine, we're all going to die, at least the body. So there is no good or bad here. There's just in support of or not in support of some ideology I have. So there is no qualitative time. And then purposeful, well, who are you and where do you exist? I mean, because this body was born without you in it. And the only reason why you have a you inside of your conceptual matrix is because language allows that to exist. And the language resonates inside the default mode network of the brain and creates essentially artificial intelligence. I have an entire video on that. I don't feel that I need to get into it. You can go watch that video, do some fucking homework. Okay.
Time and duration are based on cyclical quantitative events. The question was asked above, how much time is there between two events? We simply cannot say without counting the number of quantitative cycles that we are using as a background or matrix. A woven fabric, canvas if you will, upon which we can paint our experience. In other words, the number of times a clock ticks, or the number of seasons, moon or solar cycles, etc. In our language, we often use the word time to be synonymous with the word event, as in, at the party, plates of food were spilled 3 times, or the batter came to the plate 4 times during the game. Consider the words eventual and eventually. Don't these words mean further downstream in time in the sequence of future events? So, the arrow of time is based on sequence. Humans experience time as a directional series of sequential events, the smallest of which we are generally only subconsciously aware, being that of our own heartbeat, essentially equivalent to a second.
But you can get into even shorter spans of time, like the resonance inside your head, the noise talking to itself inside your head, and that can happen continuously and so fast that when you actually get out of it, you now start getting into minutes, start seeming just long, and you get a lot done when you're not inside the language, and all your energy can now manifest stuff into the universe. Okay, so this is that video. You guys can finish watching that. I don't need to play the whole thing. So Miles Mathis, mathematician, and he goes after physics. He doesn't seem to know a lot about ether physics or Eric Dollard's work or the electric universe. He's sticking kind of to a classical physics and what mathematics and stuff can do. He's kind of a dick. And so here he's talking about time is just a measurement of movement. Okay. So I don't want to read. Let's see if I figured this out. No.
I maintain that time is simply a measurement of movement. This is its most direct definition. Whenever we measure time, we measure movement. We cannot measure time without measuring movement. The concept of time is dependent upon the concept of movement. Without movement, there is no time. Every clock measures movement. The vibration of a cesium atom, the swing of pendulum, the movement of a second hand. In this way, time can be thought of as a distance measurement. When we measure distance, we measure movement, we measure the change in position. When we measure time, we measure the same thing, but give it another name. Why would we do this? Why give two names and two concepts to the same thing, distance and time? I say, in order to compare one to the other, time is just a second, comparative measurement of distance.
Okay, so then he goes into measuring velocities, and he gets into some philosophy and some physics. He's a big Karl Popper fan, and I haven't read a lot of Karl Popper, but I like some of the things Miles Mathis has to say, but he needs to get deeper into like 19th century physics. But he also gets into why Einstein's just full of shit, which is also good. So, So here. Nope. Keyboard shortcuts when I'm not used to using them. Okay. Whatever. I lost that spot, but whatever. So you can read this article and you'll be able to see essentially time is a regularity. It's an assumption of regularity. And that I can train my mind to play that game. You can also look at a book like this. You can look this. You can still probably find this for free. And you just look it up. So this is about the Mayan calendar. Jose Aguilares sees himself as the reincarnation of a prophet. Why not? Of the Mayan people. And then he gets into some of the histories of time and how clocks were distributed and how the calendars were messed with to screw with our natural organization consciously with time. And then he gets into, we essentially have a 28-day lunar cycle, and there's 13 of those within a single solar year. 13 times 28 is 364. You add an extra day outside of calendar time to make up for the solar year. Then every 52 years, you add an extra 13 days to make up for all the leap years. But every month you're following a lunar cycle, and every new moon is on the 1st and the full moon's on the 28th. And it's a very powerful and useful system for keeping track of time, as opposed to these broken calendar systems we use. So, and these broken calendar systems we use of like 31 and 30 and 28 and, sometimes 29 days. It's all around banking and finance. Because China and in the East will use lunar calendars for just about everything. They only use Western calendars to deal with business. It's not really a part of their daily life in the same way as we would assume it to be. Okay, so back to money changes everything, time and money. And so he wants to get into essentially the definition of time as money. So I don't know if this has a, okay, so in order to keep track of commodity trading, cuneiform was invented. But before there was cuneiform, there was using these rocks or these clay tokens. Now, before there were clay tokens, they used little clay pebbles. Right. So you would use little clay pebbles, and as your sheep came in a chute, you would move one for every sheep that came through as you went out for the day, and then you know how many sheep left, and then when they come back, then you move the stones back or the little clay pebbles back, and you know if you've gained or lost any sheep, but you didn't have any words for it. Or any way to mark it, because they didn't have writing yet. And the human brain's only capable of recognizing 4 things at most for the average person. And so most cultures that didn't get into writing or keeping track of commodities never count higher than 3. 1, 2, 3, many. Sometimes just 1, 2, many. Okay. So we go back to Goatsman. And so what ended up happening is that system evolved into this, with the clay tablets. Come on. Okay. And so he gets into bringing in the tokens into the temples. He gets into the archaeology of it. I can make a later video where it just reads through some of this. Getting into what ancient contracts were, getting into financial accounts, how time, so once it's decoupled from the seasons and from astronomical phenomena, and then you start making time about money, and you just completely break people free of their existence in reality as a phenomena of reality, and they become a phenomena of this imaginary concept of time. It's just extremely, extremely sad to watch. So let me see. Okay, the origin of the word for interest. All right, come on.
Origin of the word for interest. What gave the ancient Sumerians the idea of charging one another interest? Linguistic evidence provides a clue. In the Sumerian language, the word for interest, mash, was also the term for calves. In ancient Greek, the word for interest, tokos, also refers to the offspring of cattle. The Latin term pecus, or flock, is the root of our word pecuniary. The Egyptian word for interest, like the Sumerian word, is mus and means to give birth. All these terms point to the derivation of interest rates from the natural multiplication of livestock. If you lend someone a herd of 30 cattle for 1 year, you expect to be repaid with more than 30 cattle. The herd multiplies. The herder's wealth has a natural rate of increase. Money changes everything. How finance makes civilization possible. Money changes everything.
No.
How finance made civilization possible.
Anyway, so delivered back to the household, various other commodities such as onions, chickpeas, garlic, barley, madder, raisins, dates, wheat, oxen. No. All right. So in trying to get this screen reader to work, I have lost my place in the book. Okay. Origins of the word for interest. Okay, so natural increase equal to the rate of reproduction of the livestock. If cattle were the standard currency, the loans and all comparable commodities would be expected to give birth as well, right? So this is interest. You have to have a fucking currency that gives birth in order for interest to function. Gold and silver can't do that. So this is one of the key points of this book by Geist, Charles Geist. Beggar thy neighbor. Right, with fun little quotes in it here, like after the discovery of America, capital was in demand, and men were ready to pay interest on it. Then the theologians were obliged to review their teachings. If it had come to this, that money must be had and men would pay interest on it, ecclesiastical ethics must be revised. Okay, so he gets into history of money. So, and then he gets into the philosophy of interest and payments. And here, Aristotle's dictum that money was sterile, having no intrinsic qualities other than being used as a medium of exchange. It could not beget itself, and therefore usury was not useful. So usury, as he'll talk about, is just a variant of the Latin word for interest. Right, so this is what we see here. Money began as biological currency. By the time to Aristotle, it was broken. And he's saying you cannot charge me interest on non-biological currencies. Okay. Well, what we get into here is what the Sumerians had built, and then we get into this is talking about Wall Street. All these issues in Wall Street. Creating abstract wealth, essentially credit cards and clay tablets and crap like that. Debt and risk and financing trade and joint ventures and all these issues we see today, and not much else has been developed. And so what we see is in Anatolia, so you have these different city-states, right? So here we talk about the switch. Anatolia, in what is now modern Turkey, and Susa, in what is now modern Iran, import such goods as stone bowls. And so what we see is silver can't breed. And it has little practical use if you're not into electronics. And when it became, it didn't start as a tool of trade. When it became a tool of trade, you ended up breaking currency. silver was used as a currency. It often may have played a role in a virtual sense as opposed to a concrete one. So remember that the interest charge on silver is completely virtual. There's no way silver can breed the way a cow can. So you're getting into mind games here. I do as I say, not as I do. If I control the creation of the currency and the currency can't breed itself, and I have a law system that requires you to pay back more than you borrowed, and you can't create your own currency, and it's something hard to get like silver or gold or cash that is printed by a government, you're fucked and you're a slave. And so this is just a discussion of how it got into Babylon and took over everything. Brothers were using financial contracts against each other. The trade markets go out. They go nuts. Okay. And what we have here is you've got, I'm looking for a section on there was a section in here discussing the first war backed by bankers. And that was what destroyed Assyria, Babylon. But I don't have this memorized and sectioned out. I'm just digging through the book as we go, and you guys can read it, get more detail out of it. But anyway, here we have money moving into Athens. And the change based on growth, based on getting people into debt. He'll talk about banking and investments, but you also get into how financial literacy, as he discusses here, was required, to be a good citizen, because your job was to go and vote on laws that then controlled the debt. But as Aristotle pointed out, you're charging interest on a currency. You can't do that if the currency can't breed itself. So he also talks about how democracy, pooling of common interests, and distribution control through mechanisms such as whatever. So here, so democracy was all about controlling money. And that's all it's really ever been about, is controlling money and then controlling people with money. I mean, that's democracy, period. Because you're not producing a currency to pay because you're not producing a currency to repay the interest with, but you're charging it on people, and then you're getting them involved in laws on how to control each other for not being able to pay an unpayable interest. And that's essentially the whole of banking, period. I mean, I just broke down banking for you like that fast, and democracy. So let's go over to Beggar Thy Neighbor and see what's in this. And this is a pretty dense book. A lot of good information about the Pope and banking and the Knights Templar. Chapter 1. God and nature and reason, all scripture, all law, all authors, all doctors, yea, all councils are against usury. Philosophers, Greeks, Latins, lawyers, vines, Catholics, heretics, all tongues, all nations have thought usury as bad as a thief. That's interest on non-biological currency. That's what usury is, period. Interest became known as usura. So he has other anecdotes in here about how banks move things around, but here. So in Babylon, you have to remember that Deuteronomy essentially points out that if you're an Israelite, a Jew, don't lend at interest to other Jews, but you can lend at interest to non-Jews. That's literally what this says. Leviticus and Deuteronomy say the same thing. And then whenever the Torah leaves Babylon, you get this. Nehemiah then begins using interest the same way they were using it in Babylon as a 12% interest ratio. And that's what controlled society. Is you would use interest to punish each other internally, but you would never charge each other interest on loans, and then you charge everybody else interest on loans. And so this is the medieval pogroms. He gets into how Justinian had made interest illegal for the state. It's just sick, right? What interest has done to us. So I can make a longer video about this to dig through these and show you what's going on. But essentially Israel right now, Turkey and Israel, the Pope and England and like the Federal Reserve and all the central banks, that's what you're dealing with banking. And since language has no intrinsic meaning, right? This is just light coming off these symbols to your eye. And then it triggers ideas in it based on your understanding of what these symbols are supposed to mean. But if you're illiterate, you get no meaning out of it. And if you're coming from a different language, you get a different meaning out of it than somebody that grew up with this language. And if you grew up a Satanist or a Catholic or a Jew or a Hindu, you're going to get different triggers off of these. Because that's the context that the words activate inside your imagination. It's not the same for any two people. This shit is meaningless in and of itself. These symbols have never made sound in the history of mankind. And so if you didn't know how to speak and you didn't know how to read, you wouldn't be able to look at this page and get any information out of it without somebody else drilling into your head what it is. All right. Well, maybe that's a decent introduction to banking.